In the fall of 2014, Mexico's city governmental Women's Institute in Mujeres and a network of lesbian mothers, Red de Madres Lesbianas, launched a campaign about lesbian motherhoods in the Mexico City transportation system. Passengers traveling across the city could see the poster, which you see here, which read Una mamá, dos mamás, tres mamás. Todas las familias somos iguales. Maternidades lésbicas visibles. On the poster, I recognized the faces of some of my friends and other women who were present at the photo shoot I attended earlier in the summer. The poster read, one mother, two mothers, three mothers. As we can see here, all images presented two mothers with children. But where were the single mothers with children or the three women with a child, the title of the poster announced, and I saw photographed last summer? So this poster captures some of the tensions between monogamy and polyamory and imaginaries around new queer relationships emerging in contemporary Mexico City. My research investigates these tensions as connected to the transformation of intimacy in the lives of three generations of women in queer communities in Mexico City. In this paper, I explore how women participating in queer spaces negotiate discourses on new relationships which are emerging in a context of social, economic, and legal transformations. I approach this work aware that studies on same-sex sexuality in Mexico and Latin America have predominantly paid attention to gender and sexual subject formation. Less attention, though, has been paid to subject relations, which, in my view, have been central to queer politics in Mexico City since year 2000, through public debates on same-sex unions and marriages, and in queer spaces on polyamory. This presentation is based on fieldwork I conducted in Mexico City since 2000, but particularly in 2009-2010, which included participant observation, 40 qualitative interviews, and the review of newspapers of record. I first briefly discussed the ways in which queer politics have broadly shifted in the past decade and a half, and then focus on new queer relationships produced in the context, particularly convivencia and polyamory. So I'm now going to talk about the timeline that concerned this paper. In 2009, Mexico City became the first place in Latin America to legalize same-sex marriage. Prior to this, since 2001, there was a motion to pass a cohabitation law called Sociedades de Convivencia, which was supported by 300 organizations. It is important to know that Sociedades is a law that can include two or more people who might or not be romantically tied. So, for example, a lesbian couple could acquire sociedad, but also a brother and a sister, or three roommates living under a same roof. So it is a law that makes room for different forms of cohabitation and that provides mostly inheritance and visitation rights. I next discuss how narratives that lead to and following Sociedades de Convivencia were negotiated in individual lives. So during fieldwork, many individuals who learn I research on queer culture in Mexico City assumed that I wanted to know more about Sociedades de Convivencia and later the reform on marriage. One night when I attended a soccer game with my friend Astrid, she insisted I interview Clara, Astrid's only friend who had acquired a convivencia. So to convivenciar meant to acquire a legal union under Sociedades de Convivencia. It is a colloquial term I heard jokingly used in a few queer circles when I was living in Mexico City in the 2000s. Before the law passed, in other words, women participating in queer spaces were negotiating and producing new forms of relationship as the context was changing. So on a Saturday morning, I went to interview Clara at her home in Colonia Ampliación Piloto, which is at the western edges of Mexico City. Clara and two of her friends, Sofia and Monica, picked me up at the nearest subway stop. We drove for miles through a gray landscape filled with streets, square houses made out of concrete, and small shops advertising bubblegum, chips, and cigarette brands. So when we arrived to Clara's, the dogs were barking behind the metal door. Clara lived with her partner, Karina. She owned a local pastry shop. with her extended family. While Karina took care of some of the administrative aspects of the business, occasionally she also practiced law. She had studied at the National University UNAM. So, as I tried to start the interview, I was surprised to find that Karina and her two friends would not leave the living room. The event turned more into a talk show rather than a traditional interview. Their friend Brenda, who had known Clara since childhood, laughed, recalling how Clara and her used to flirt with girls in elementary school through cartitas, little letters. While Clara answered most of the questions, Karina would jump in from time to time to correct her partner. So the couple had met 8 years ago at Anyways, a queer club that used to be near La Zona Rosa. Clara says that she does not like to remember that Karina had another date on that night. She continues, "We began chatting, and she told me she was a lawyer, right? And I say to her, Uy, I have this question because I have a problem with Hacienda, which is like the IRS. And Clara insisted that she was not flirting with Karina, and she really only asked for Karina's phone number because of her tax problem. We all laughed, but Clara insisted again that it is not until the next time she ran into Karina at Anyways that she began really liking her. Ahí me flechó. There she took my heart, recalls Clara. The couple dated for about 5 years before they decided to convivenciarse. When I asked why they decided to do it, Clara jokingly said, "Es que la quería amarrar." I wanted to tie her up. Her words imply that she did not want Karina to leave. Unsatisfied with her partner's response, Karina jumped in half a second later. And here we have the translation in English. So, es ser congruente con los mismos derechos que uno va peleando. No podemos decir, pues está ahí la ley y no ejercerla. Bueno, somos una pareja que de verdad queremos ser una pareja para generar una familia. Aparte por la cuestión de la seguridad, yo trabajo, ella trabaja, se generan bienes. Cuando no había ese tipo de protección para nuestro ambiente era que llegaba la familia del que ya se había muerto y dejaba sin calzones a la otra persona. Estamos tan enamoradas que llega este momento de decir, ¿por qué si los heterosexuales tienen una forma de manifestar ese amor ante la sociedad, por qué nosotras no? Entonces igual lo hicimos, fiesta y todo el rollo, todo es así. So, although the law of convivencia was for individuals who lived together and did not necessarily have a romantic bond, it becomes clear that Karina's explanation why they decided to convivenciar involved love. In her ethnography on 2 generations of Mexican women in Western Mexico and Atlanta, Hirsch discusses how while in the past individuals in Mexico tended to marry for economic reasons, new generations now mention love and companionship as their main motive. Indeed, Karina invokes love and the desire for their union to be known by the community. Her words differ, though, from studies with women in heterosexual relationships when she suggests that they must assert their rights and protect their property. This difference is certainly not only due to the fact that Karina speaks of convivencia rather than marriage. Having convivenciado, Clara and Karina's relationship was an exception rather than the norm. So this is not surprising considering that in 2008, a year before I started formal fieldwork, only 308 couples had celebrated Sociedades de Convivencia across the whole city. Nonetheless, such relationships was well known at the time and functioned as a new possibility. The reform on marriage took place in 2010, and to my knowledge, 2 interviewees got married after, in addition to 3 friends I did not interview. According to INEGI, which is the Statistics Bureau, 689 marriages were celebrated between same-sex partners in 2010, in 2011, 802, and in 2012, 936. At the time of fieldwork, the reform was still very new. However, discursively, same-sex marriage was becoming an important relationship option. In this new context, expectations on queer life, narratives were changing. Shortly after the reform passed, my friend Nadia commented on how she had discussed with her friend Rogelio that that the good thing about being gay used to be that people would not ask you, "And you, why aren't you married?" But recently someone had asked Rogelio, "Hey, you're 30 years old, aren't you going to get married now that there is gay marriage?" Los gays nos salvamos de eso, pero ahora ya no. As gays, we were safe from this. But this is no longer true. These words signal the possibility of aligning queer lives with reproductive time. In A Queer Time and Place, Halberstam affirms that, and I quote, queer subcultures produce alternative temporalities by allowing their participants to believe that their futures can be imagined according to logics that lie outside of those paradigmatic markers of life experience, namely birth, marriage, reproduction, and death, end of quote. So at the time of fieldwork, this was certainly in part true in discourses created by the lesbian polyamorous movement. However, narratives on queer marriage and reproduction being part of queer lives were certainly circulating as well. In many ways, birth, marriage, reproduction, and death form part of the ideal course of love and life in the lives of many of my collaborators. By shifting scholarly attention from subject formation to relationship formation, it becomes evident, as stated in this section, that new relationships such as convivencia are emerging, in this case in dialogue with new laws promoted by the LGBT right activists. While Sociedades de Convivencia is a law, the colloquial term convivencia shows us that subjects are negotiating these new realities. Marriage as a relationship became a possibility for same-sex partners too. But as Nadia's story suggests, all individuals had to negotiate this possibility now, even if they had no intention to marry. Nonetheless, many question if this was the only way to organize same-sex loving relationships, which I explore next. So now we will talk about polyamory. So at the time of fieldwork, certain activists and women participating in queer spaces were questioning the idea that the only or more respectable way to organize same-sex intimacy was through monogamous coupling. During fieldwork, I attended the book release of Desobedientes, which we see the cover here, a collection of writings on polyamory launched by Latin American lesbian feminists. Why should we let our corrupt state get into our pants, asked a Zapatista activist at the reading. Chapters reflect on compulsory coupling, partners as private property, and the myth of ever after, but we also read about the everyday life of a polyamorous relationships, jealousy, complicity, and long discussions on how to keep an open relationship. Discussions on polyamory were also noticeable through workshops that were taking place in lesbian support groups. Groups such as Colectivo Poliamor that were not specific to same-sex sexuality were also active in Mexico City. Individuals also initiated the discussion group online on polyamory through tools such as Facebook. So during interviews, collaborators demonstrated how they were negotiating new narratives on polyamory that were circulating in queer spaces. In some cases, individuals were fully aware of the polyamorous proposals and they were actively considering what it meant in their lives. Selene, a 24-year-old history student at the National University, shared during the interview her views on polyamory, and we see here the translation appearing. Yo considero que soy amorosa, que amo muchas personas a la vez. En este momento amo a mis amigas, amo a mi mamá, amo a mi papá, a mis hermanos, a mi abuelito y a mi sobrino. Y en ese sentido es un tanto el poliamor. En este lo llevamos a cabo aunque no lo sepamos. En cuanto a destinarme sexualmente, yo le he hablado con Diana. Le costaría trabajo, pero ella está abierta a que yo experimente con otras personas y es algo que igual a mí me da miedo, que no puedo hacer nada más así. So in this quote, Selene first clarifies her definition of polyamory, which involves the term love beyond the confines of romantic love and our sexual bonds. Discussions on polyamory had split open the meaning of love to question romantic love, but also friendship, familial love, and other forms of affection. The study of various relationships between women signals to Adrienne Rich's notion of a lesbian continuum. This continuum includes sex between women among relationship modalities, but also non-sexual interactions such as, and I quote, sharing of a rich inner life, bonding against male tyranny, the giving and receiving practical and political support, end of quote. So although Rich writes in dialogue with 1980s social and political dilemmas in the US, the notion of a continuum is useful since it signals the difficulties of locking apart interactions into a precise kind of relationship. I found this reflection on different kinds of love to be common, particularly among younger women I interviewed. Selene is nonetheless aware that certain ways of defining polyamory related often to sexual practices when she speaks of a certain agreement with her girlfriend Diana. In stating, "It's something that really scares me," Selene suggests that difficulties of transgressing established boundaries in the of transgressing established boundary, pardon me. In the words of philosopher Neri Arriaga, in polyamory, there only exist probabilities and alternatives. So Selene finds herself facing uncertainty with the possibility of taking a path for which there is, in theory, no clear blueprint. The polyamorous proposal contrasted with same-sex marriage and what in the north of the continent has been termed homonormativity, a non-oppositional queer politics centered on domesticity and consumption. So I discuss next how a lesbian organization negotiated new discourses on polyamory. So when organizations and the state negotiate polyamory. So now back to the questions we started with today. Not only individuals had to negotiate new discourses on marriage and polyamory, but organizations did as well. As mentioned, the poster that we see back here, promoted in the subway in 2004, read "One mother, two mothers, three mothers, all families are equal, visible lesbian motherhoods." When I asked Ana de Alejandro, one of the main group leaders, about the title, she suggested that they chose 1, 2, 3 mothers because some children might grow up in a family with mothers in a polyamorous relationship. Others might have a single lesbian mother, and one of them has a new partner who takes part in the child's education. Ana pointed towards Karina and Monica and said they are 2 mothers, but their niece also takes care of their son. So they really are 3 mothers. With the while the poster displayed the title 1, 2, 3 mothers, all pictures depicted 2 women with children, if you notice. The title challenged public representation of parenthood, but images reasserted the idea of monogamous coupling and the reproductive family. Interestingly, it becomes clear that polyamory is not always at odds with queer politics centered on domesticity. Yet, the tension between the image and the text questions if the association between the monogamous couple and the reproductive family may be questioned in the public sphere. So, in conclusion, to conclude, the themes I have focused on today illustrate how queer women in Mexico City have been forming relationships after NAFTA in a period of economic, political, and cultural changes. I argue that intimate relations have become a site of contestation and show how women participating in queer spaces negotiate discourses on convivencia, same-sex marriage, and polyamory, often mapping them through existing cultural meanings and practices, but also revetting love, relationships, and the social organization of intimacy. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to present my work. Thank you.